For joining me for another oil painting demonstration video. This subject is going to be more complicated than previous paintings, and I wanted to show the techniques that I use for painting more complicated multi-character portraits. So you can see I'm starting with the conventional wash of burnt umber to establish the lines of the dynamic symmetry grid, which I've explained in previous videos. And in this painting I'm going to have two characters that are interacting in a sense, but they're facing away from the viewer. It's going to be two Japanese ladies visiting a Shinto oracle where the fortune-telling cards are kept in a cabinet, and having their backs turned to the viewer is sort of in the style of Gerhard Richter, when he would portray women with their backs turned to paint sort of photorealism of the hair, but it anonymizes the figure, and that's suggestive of the patriarchy and the role of women in society being subjugated to wallflowers. And that's also demonstrated by the saturation and the vivid color of the kimonos themselves. So you can see with this dynamic symmetry grid, or harmonic armature, or whatever name it goes by, I'm not following it rigidly or dogmatically. I just use it to help me when I can conveniently place part of the figure along those lines. I try to do that just to lend more classical gravity, more sense of rhythm to the image. And most of my representational paintings are intended for a decorative appeal. Not all representational paintings are intended that way. Some people use representational art as expression and often sort of blur the lines between representational and abstraction, but I try to keep the two separated. And when I'm painting representational art, it's usually with an eye to the viewer and trying to present it in a harmonious or aesthetically pleasing way, such as would be marketable. And with that in mind, you can see that I'm using a ruler to carefully establish the perspective lines of the oracle cabinet in the background. And when you're composing a scene, horizontal lines give a sense of calm and composure, where diagonals and verticals tend to be more active participants in the painting, which in this case we want for the figures, which are the subject of the painting, to occupy the verticality, and then the cabinet will have those calm horizontals in the background to help balance the composition. And with that dynamic symmetry grid, there's a sort of zigzag that flows up a composition where you want the viewer to follow visually, and that's something that I've tried to establish here and be true to. And it's important to remember when you're composing an image and using dynamic symmetry, the rule of thirds, or anything like that, that you're not necessarily thinking about the outline of the subject, but more where the areas of contrast are going to fall, which can be like folds of clothing. And in a lot of classical portraits, a lot of classical artwork, you'll see like someone like John Singer Sargent would always have the folds of clothing or the dark of the hair or something like that would fall along one of those lines, where the actual face, or the actual, like in this case, the lady on the right, her neck forms an important focal point or a focus of the painting because of the lightness of the color, and it's just to the right. It sort of lines up with the bottom terminus of the dynamic grid there. It's close to that golden ratio point, but up. I don't know, I'm sure there are terms for these sub-ratios, and the set of golden ratio calipers I have are actually made for eyebrows, and the far point is one that corresponds to the line. If you trace one of these lines from the diagonal down to the intersecting line that forms that 1.618 node, the point that it lines up at is about the point of her neck on the right upper quadrant. And all of that is to say that the point that you're actually using as your focal point is going to be sort of surrounded by or cradled in a darker color, which is how you often will see in a more traditional, straightforward portrait, dark hair, or like in Victorian times they would wear white collars. And so anything black or white against human skin tone is going to help to establish that as a focal point. And you can see now I'm beginning to add color, and with this video being 3 times regular speed, this will give you a sense of how much time I'm actually spending with the drawing portion. We're at about 20 minutes of real time now, and if you watch some of my earlier videos, you'll see that it's very unusual for me to spend a lot of time in that initial block-in period. I try to just get the paint on as quickly as I can, but because this is a bit more complicated scene, and it's important to make sure that we have all of the geometry accurate with that oracle box and everything, it's worth taking a bit more time. And I use that burnt umber wash, but if you prefer to do graphite, pencil, charcoal, willow charcoal, there's an actual paint mixture that's made from ash, like bone ash, but I forget what it's called. It has some French name. You can use something like that, whatever you're more comfortable with, or just like a graphite pencil. And someone like Gerhard Richter, or any of these academic realist, photorealistic painters, a lot of them would use an actual grid and trace a photo through the grid. Or a lot of modern painters are using projectors. You can get very inexpensive projectors now, and I would not dissuade you from doing that if that's something, if you're trying to learn to paint, or if you're painting strictly to sell decorative paintings and you're not concerned as much about learning all of the intricacies of it. Because for me, the mistakes are an important part of the process, and I think that's maybe what elevates art beyond craft. There's certainly much that could be said about the distinction between art and craft or illustration, and I have digressed into those discussions in previous videos, so there's no need to really linger too much on it in this one. But you can see I'm starting to add the color for the flowers and the hair there, and that's going to play the role that I was describing earlier of sort of turning these portraits, or what would otherwise be portraits, into something more akin to a still life. And we're trying to help the viewer see more than identifying with these faceless figures, and instead just seeing them as decorative objects. These bright kimonos and the bright pink chrysanthemum in the hair, and the dark mahogany of the oracle cabinet in the background helps to focus on the figures and to turn the form, which is something that lately I've been working through. And when you're learning to paint, you're really learning some of the rules of composition more than you are necessarily the technique of painting itself. And it's a lot like with music, when you learn the notes and then you're able to improvise with those notes. When you're painting, you learn some of the things about color and about form and dimensionality and the gradients that shape an object. So for me, I've begun to realize how important it is to really have a lot of dark color in the background, and that's not always an obvious thing, because I started and I learned primarily as a landscape painter, which I think is what a lot of oil painters start with, from our Lord and Savior Bob Ross. And so many landscapes are mostly sky, and unless you happen to paint nocturnes, which is something I want to explore, but I'm not really too keen on the whole idea of going outside with LED lights and all of that to paint. But I've painted a few in the studio, and I'm not especially good at it. But by and large, landscape paintings are going to have that light blue sky. And so when I was learning to paint, I would paint a lot of still lifes, a lot of floral paintings, and I would put some lighter colors in the background. And when you're observing from photographs or even observing in life, you don't really see a background as being inherently dark. But I've looked at Rembrandt, and I've looked at not Botticelli, whatever, the Caravaggio, the chiaroscuro painters, and how they used Von Dyke brown and these really dark. There's another color that they used. I think I mentioned earlier about charcoal, willow charcoal. There's a bone ash pigment that was used by Von Dyke and by Rembrandt and those painters, that was used to get those really dark, saturated, vivid black colors in the background. And I'm finding that while it seems cliche to me to do that, and it was important for me personally to go through years of trial and error and kicking against the pricks and trying to tell myself that I don't want to paint these dark backgrounds just because that's the conventional thing to do. And it's the same way with music for me. Like, I experimented with aleatoric music, or using dissonances and things, just because I really always tried to push myself, and I didn't want to do something just because it's the way it's done. And that's part of my mentality, and the mentality of a lot of artistically inclined people, I think, is to really have this urgent need to understand something. And as in the scriptural knowing, it's important to me to really intimately connect with a thing before I adapt it to my uses. And that's how it is with the chiaroscuro background. I didn't want to do it just because that's what's done. I wanted to, try different things. And it was only after years of experimenting and gradually darkening backgrounds that I started to understand the importance of it. And it's not necessarily that you always have your darkest darks in the background, and I think by and large that's not the case. Especially, you always want to avoid strong contrasts around the periphery, and dark has to be used without it being a contrast, if that makes sense. Like, the hair on these figures is going to be one of the darkest colors because that is a point that we want to draw the attention to. And dark colors, true deep rich colors, are going to come forward in the same way that vivid saturated reds and warm colors come forward. And muted colors and gray, dark or deep gray colors will go back. And the very fact of my struggling so to explain this is why it's important to practice, because a lot of the terminology is lost on me until I really experienced it, because it's easy to see, like it's easy for me to say, or it's easy for me to see in a textbook that saturated colors, or the idea of a cool red or a warm blue and things like that. And I read books about color theory and about chiaroscuro and deep backgrounds, but it wasn't until I really experimented with it myself that I began to appreciate and understand the need to use deeper colors in a background. And it's part of it, I think, is elegance, and having a light colored background makes things look cut out or cheap. And my plan is I want to do a sort of long form video. I hope that I can do it without relying on a script, for the simple fact that I don't wish to devote the time to writing a script. But I want to do a video about AI art criticism, because that's where I picked up on this idea about things looking cut and pasted or illustrated. It was something that I had noticed in my work, but AI language models like GPT and Gemini would consistently mention to me that certain aspects looked cut and pasted, and I didn't really understand that. But it's partly a consequence of a lack of dynamics between the foreground and the background. And I think that it's something that occurs in nature, and maybe to some degree occurs with photography, where, for example, if you see something on a hot day and there's that haze around it, there's always a sort of boundary. It's almost getting into the metaphysics when people talk about auras, but there's this roundness to forms where things darken. And I think I've mentioned in previous videos that that's one of the observations I made about painting, is the graying effect of the outline, and the importance of spending time turning the form or establishing the outline of a figure. And that's where that understanding of color comes in, and where the importance of saturated darks especially comes in, because if you really observe things, a lot of times the darkest color is the one that's closest to you. Like if you're painting, and it really is important to do studies of fruit, like apples or still lifes, the sort of thing that we're taught in grade school art classes, where you draw an apple and you learn how to shade the apple, and all of these art textbooks will feature an apple. And the reason being is that the skin of an apple has that same specularity or reflectivity similar to human skin. And if you can learn to paint the shadow, cast shadow, highlights and everything on apples and oranges, you can apply that same technique to painting portraits, to painting landscapes, and so on and so forth. And that's where you can learn a lot about the forming of the outline and the role of the background in bringing the subject forward, which sometimes is done through complementary colors. Because this painting is a good example of this, because if you're painting a landscape or something like that, the background is going to be far in the distance. So we would follow Bob Ross's rule of having things more blue and lighter colored in the distance. He would always paint his mountains and paint the misty base of the mountain and so forth. But when you're painting something like this, which is why I say that I'm treating this portrait a bit like a still life, because these figures are like flowers in a vase in a still life, where the background is very near the observer. There's no atmospheric perspective at all. So the color of that mahogany cabinet is going to be just as saturated and as vivid as the color of the figures themselves. So that's where the role of the artist is in translating that division and giving the suggestion or the illusion of depth and separation between the objects, so that even though they may be similar in value range, similar in saturation, there are the outlines of the figures themselves that are helping to separate them from the background. And you can see I'm using a lot of very small brushes, perhaps smaller than I should have, and a lot of times I do that. I tend to overanalyze and fixate anytime there's a portrait involved, or when I'm painting a human figure, I tend to fuss over it more than I should, and I think that's a natural human response. And sometimes I wonder if we paid as much attention to fabric and flowers and the wooden cabinet panels as we do to an earlobe, if that wouldn't make for better paintings, because we're sort of, it's almost like an artistic animism if you can treat inanimate objects with the same dignity and respect which we reserve for humans. And that's almost the corollary to the message of this painting being that these ladies are almost part of the furniture. What if the furniture is also a lady? And that's, I think, maybe one of the lessons that the artist can learn in such an image as this, and maybe what Gerhard Richter was pointing towards. And for me, this image being one of religious devotion is also part of that message, because they are at this oracle shrine to get their fortunes told, and it's a sort of prayerful posture, and that's also part of the artistic process. I find art and religion are intimately connected, and there's maybe something ironic about it in that devotion to religion, in that turning to the oracle, that veneration of the oracle, so similar to the way that women perform for their role in society and patriarchy, and the way we all perform for society is part of the absurdity of religion. And I think that that's on display a bit in this painting. And you can see I'm just continuing to fuss over some of the details and the highlights of the ear in the reference monitor that I'm using in this video editing suite. It's a very small monitor, so I can't really see all of the detail that's going on here, but I think I just added a highlight to the ear, and this is about the halfway point of the painting, and it's at this point that I usually begin to roughly establish where some of the highlights are going to be. And as I've spoken about in previous videos on this channel, the area that you want to spend the most time on is going to be the focal point. So for this painting, it's obvious the heads of the two ladies as they're looking over the oracle, and sort of, they're not literally in conversation, but compositionally they're in conversation. And that's how, whenever you paint figures in a composition, for the most part, they're going to be facing one another or engaging with one another in some way. And that's, if you watch art criticism channels, that's something that comes up a lot. When people fault a painting, it's because if there are people in the painting, their gestures or their attention are divided and leading the eye in different ways. Whereas if two characters in a composition are engaged with one another, seemingly, that helps the viewer to keep their attention between those two characters and not wandering off into the composition. And the austerity of Japanese furniture, such as this oracle cabinet, helps to keep the attention on the figures, because it's so strongly contrasted to the vivid decorated kimonos with all of these bold patterns on them. And there's almost like a pop art sort of characteristic to this painting, where those stripes on the kimonos and the geometric patterns are painted very broadly, and the fabric itself is painted in that sort of that manner, like, I forget the painter's name, Hockney, where he would paint sort of primary colors and starkly, almost in an illustrated way, less concerned with the academic realism of the thing. So this painting sort of walks the line between academic realism and impressionism with aspects of pop art, I suppose would be the term. And you can see I'm brightening that mahogany color in the background. It's actually a vermilion cabinet. I think it's a shade of vermilion. I'm not sure if they use real vermilion in cabinets like that. And I can't remember if in this painting whether I used vermilion. I have a very small tube of it that I've used very sparingly. I've had it for about 2 years, and I'm only about halfway through with it, just because it's so expensive and I don't want to waste any of it. But it's a wonderful color. It's an opaque red, similar to like burnt sienna with cadmium red, but it's there's no color like it, and that's why it's so expensive. And speaking of women's issues and patriarchy and whatnot, supposedly women have more rods or cones in the eye, and can actually distinguish more shades of red than men can. And I've mentioned that in a previous video, but it's always interesting to me, and I always wonder if maybe if my color accuracy is lacking in some ways. Because when I'm mixing colors, there are shades of red like Rouge Profundo and Scarlet Lake that will look absolutely identical to me. And I don't know if that's due to my gender, due to my age, but for whatever reason I cannot distinguish one color from the other until I mix them with titanium white or a blue or something like that. And maybe the more I paint, I'll learn to distinguish them, but as it stands right now, I can tell that there are shades of red that I have difficulty distinguishing. My grandfather was colorblind and couldn't distinguish red from green, and that's always been interesting to me, that we really never know how people perceive the world, because if my grandfather were to try to explain to me a green light, it's still a green light to him. He couldn't, it didn't look the same to him as it did to me, but he navigated the world in the same way, and for all intents and purposes, even though his green was not my green, he experienced it as being green. And that's one of those really interesting sort of metaphysical aspects of art that I think is what draws me so much to it, is exploring perception and how we perceive, and how we observe, and the importance of observation. So you can see I'm sort of adding that faux vermilion, which, if I remember right, I think I did use a touch of genuine vermilion and then mixed it with, say, 75% cadmium red, a synthetic cadmium red, and some burnt sienna. And what I'm doing here is establishing the effect of the sunlight. And generally speaking, I try to follow what Stefan Bowman famously teaches, that highlights are always cool and shadow tones are always warm, but I'm finding that that's really not true. And especially with reds, I will still paint the highlights warm, especially if I don't want for them to compete with the subject. The specular highlight, which is what I would call it, I don't know if that's the technical term, I have no formal education, that's just what I've arrived at through my years of doing this. Like, if you look at a piece of silver, or the reflection in the eye, where you can actually see a literal reflection of the light source, like if you've ever watched a YouTube video where you can see the ring light reflected in a person's eyes, that light source is going to be cool. That's going to be a cool light, but the actual highlight itself is often warm. It can be cool, but it's often warm, and there's a gradient between the highlight going into the specular highlight. Likewise, the shadow going into the cast shadow, or the deepest dark. And that's all so complicated seemingly, but it's a lot like when you're playing jazz and there are accidentals, there are blue notes, and you can go through the rigmarole of learning, what's an inverted 13th chord and this kind of thing, but there's so much room there for improvisation that unless you do something egregiously wrong, you'll be able to explain it in some way or another. So you kind of can rely on your intuition and creativity. And that's what's so interesting about painting, is when you're learning to paint. Like for me, I would hear people say things like that, and I'd think, well, so there are no rules to art. You can do whatever you want to do. And yes, you can do whatever you want to do. But if you don't learn the rules, it's going to appear the same way that if you listen to someone play music who doesn't learn music theory. They can often write really good music, but Kurt Cobain was never Mozart. And that's how it is with painting. Like, you can make good paintings, and if you're just trying to do, say, street art, graffiti, something like comic art, then you really don't have to learn formal theory, and it's not necessary. But if you're trying to do anything approaching academic realism, anything approaching like formal traditional painting like this, then you do need to learn the rules you're breaking, I guess, would be what I would say. And all of that is just to say that when I'm painting these reds for the background here, whether they're warm or cool is not strictly limited to what I'm seeing in the photograph, but I'm reacting to the colors around them and considering what would make it a more effective composition. And that's where artistic liberty comes in, and the importance of the artist as more than just a copying machine. And that's where AI will, I'm not going to say never say never, because who knows what advancements the future may hold if Sam Altman ever comes up with his general intelligence or whatever nonsense he claims. But in the current state of artificial language models or image generation, they're never really going to be able to make the kind of decisions that humans make with regard to aesthetics and what makes a pleasing composition, because machines don't experience color the way we do. Machines don't have to walk over to their computer and change the music the way I did in this video. And like what I'm doing here is trying to paint the glass color in all those little cubicles, and an image generator would not make these sort of mistakes, and it would have a very efficient way to just do that. But when you see the human touch in a painting like this, and you look at a painting in person and see all of the mistakes, see all of the places where the actual biological mechanism of the human hand varying in its weight and that sort of thing, it's never going to be able to be replicated by a machine because of the actual biology involved, unless they have cybernetics and start putting computers in brain cells or whatever. But by that time, and I think artists will always be cheaper than computers. So. And I've learned to kind of enjoy doing some of the more repetitive things like this in paintings. It's an opportunity to turn off the mind and kind of a meditative experience. That's a difficult word for me to say. And this is why I try to explain to people that if I'm painting an abstract painting, it takes a lot more thought, focus, and attention than if I'm painting something like this that has a lot of detail, where detail is actually the easiest thing to do, because you're just performing a motion over and over again, and that's more like a craft painting. And if you look at some of the Arabic calligraphy or Indian mandala paintings, they're very sophisticated and they're very beautiful, but they're craft work. They're not artwork, because there's really not a lot of intuition, there's not a lot of volition, a lot of decision making involved. You're just doing the same motion over and over again, and it's important to include that in paintings if you're doing this kind of painting. But whether or not that's high art is not for me to say. And if you notice in all of my videos, I hold my brushes back quite a long way, and a lot of people will really choke up on the brush and like hold it near the tip like a pencil. And you'll find that holding the brush farther back will actually give you more control over it than holding it closely. And like Monet used these ridiculously long handled brushes that were like feet long, because he had a tremble as he got older, and that let him keep his hands steady. And I've often thought it would be kind of neat if they made brushes that were a bit longer than the ones that are commercially available, and for whatever reason no one makes them. And I read about it online, and there's some reason for it. I think it has to do with like the length of the forearm, that anything beyond that is like a law of diminishing returns or something. But you'll notice that I tend to hold the brush as far back as I can, and it serves a twofold purpose, both in helping with control, because you're using motion more from your elbow or from your full body rather than the wrist or the fingers, and it necessitates standing farther away from the canvas, which helps to keep everything in context and to focus on the composition over the minutiae of the detail, and worrying about painting each petal of the chrysanthemum or the highlight of each petal of the chrysanthemum. And that's something, when I was learning to paint, I actually started out painting miniatures, and I was really interested in Mughal paintings of India, where they would paint these little 1 centimeter tall images of Krishna, and I tried to learn to paint that way with illustrated outlines and so forth, and I'm not really very good at that kind of painting. And it was just over the years I kind of gravitated more towards a style that suited my proclivities and my natural aptitude. But whenever I hear art teachers impelling their students to paint loosely and make broad gestures and this sort of thing, I think that can be taken too far to the opposite extreme, and that if you really are setting out to paint loosely or paint disdainfully for the sake of convention, or it's the same way I was explaining about my experiences with chiaroscuro, or painting a dark background because that's the thing to do. When it comes to loose painting or gestural mark making, if you set out to do that because you're told to in art school, it will have a certain look to it that I always recognize when I see it, because I see a lot of students that have graduated from Savannah College of Art and Design who are ostensibly artists, people in their 20s who are in many ways more accurate than I am, who are more technically proficient than I am, but there's a sterility to their mark making because there's really not any deliberate attempt or like naive sort of spontaneity, that real verve where you're desperately trying to put something on the canvas that's immediate and represents your sensation or your perception of this thing. And if you're going at it in this regimented fashion where you're told by your art instructor that you're supposed to use a big number 12 flat brush or whatever, I don't think in terms of numbers. I just kind of look and see what brush looks about the right size and kind of eyeball everything. But when you're taking that formulaic approach that is taught and drilled into students in these schools, because we don't need no education, but when they're painting that way, it looks really nice, and you see these broad, lush brush marks and expensive paint and expensive brushes, but it's like, to me it doesn't look sincere, and there's something about those paintings that I can always recognize them, and you see them in all the galleries, and they're really nice, and they make a lot of money, and they sell well and everything, but it's not the same as if you see a painting by like Andrew Wyeth or N.C. Wyeth or was Norman Rockwell or somebody like that, where you can tell that they put the years and decades into practicing and learning all of these things and not doing it for the sake of that being the way you're supposed to paint. So I'll get off of my soapbox, but that's sort of what I'm explaining is saying, do as I say, not as I do, because I am right now in the process of making myself learn to paint more loosely, because it is the thing to do. It is the convention, even though I have fought tooth and nail to refuse to acquiesce into that. But I'm learning that, yeah, it is necessary to paint that way, and that is an effective formula. If it weren't, it wouldn't be taught in schools. But like I said, it's just, for me personally, it's a matter of it being important to understand why you do a thing rather than do the thing simply because that's the convention. And with the idea of using loose brushwork, I think for me, if you read about Singer Sargent, who everyone holds up on a pedestal, and he was undoubtedly a wonderful painter, they always say how he was special because he painted immediately and would match colors directly on the canvas. He didn't go and do extra layers. He didn't have to start out with a rough painting and then refine it. It was refined from the moment that man put his brush hair on the canvas. It was finished, which I think is a lot of romanticism. I think it's a lot of sort of colonialist mentality that this great white hope, Singer Sargent, from the aristocracy, he was this great painter and no one else will ever be like him. I think it might be a little bit of bullshit, but that's the idea, is that the more practice you have, the more you're going to be able to paint immediately without having to do all of that unnecessary broad brushing and then going in and refining certain areas. But I don't, that's my reasoning for why I have not always taken that approach. I take a similar approach. I sort of tiptoe around it. And like, as you can see with this painting, I am refining the shapes right now, maybe too much, but I didn't really start with that wild loose brushwork in the beginning. Instead, I kind of outlined it and sort of blocked it in fairly close to where it would end up. And as a result, a lot of my paintings have a sort of naive or old-fashioned, outmoded look to them that people might associate with paintings of, self-taught artists in the 1900s or just old-fashioned illustrators. And I'm aware of that, and it's not necessarily something that I'm trying intentionally to cultivate. It's just sort of the fact that I am a product of my artistic environment, and having learned outside of the academic establishment. So the way that I've learned to paint has been trial and error, and in many ways it feels like I'm sort of following the trajectory of art history, where I started out with this primitive childish drawings as a child, and then as I got older I learned to paint the way that like the monastics painted in the Middle Ages, and then like the Renaissance style, where I'm starting to get more detailed. I forget the painter's name that did religious paintings, and that were more like academic realism, but there's still this really rigid religiosity to the paintings, and that's almost like the stage that I've been in for the past few years. And now I find myself sort of gradually approaching the threshold of contemporary painting, which is where, get back to where we once belonged. It's like that's where I probably should have started, but rather I've taken a very circuitous route to get there. But it hasn't been entirely unintentional. It's what I've been saying all through this episode, that I've wanted to understand why I do a thing before I do it. So the more I paint, the more I recognize that, like in painting the foliage on the shirt here, or the embroidery on the kimono, that the larger a brush I can use, the more natural it looks, and that if I try to use really small brushes, it's the same effect of using those short-handled brushes with my nose right near the canvas. And the line work tends to be trepidatious or broken, and it looks labored, and that's the hallmark of a consummate painter, is that it looks effortless, that it looks natural. And to look natural and effortless is often to paint loosely with larger brushes, but it's not so simple as just setting out to do that, because like I said, it's like trying to fake sincerity. You can't paint loosely by trying to paint loosely. That's part of the kung fu of art, I think. I don't know. This is why it's important to not only to practice, but to also practice intellectually, because if you just take what I'm saying at face value, you might need to go see a doctor. But if you go through my thought process as an artist, you'll eventually, I think, reach some of these conclusions. But if we've learned anything from Bob Ross, it's that you don't watch videos like this to learn anything, but just to have a happy little painting and paint some happy little kimonos. So that is what we are doing. And you can see I decided that I needed more light on the dark side of the kimono there, and that's part of what I was explaining earlier about the dimensionality of a thing, and to get the feel of the fabric turning, or the form turning, you don't want for your darkest dark to be on the outline, and you want to put some of the reflected color of the environment. And I mentioned earlier that there's no atmospheric perspective in this painting, and that's true, but there's always the atmosphere of the light that's bouncing around an environment. Unless you're on the surface of an asteroid or something, there's always going to be some kind of reflected light. And that's why even on the darker side of a white material like this, it's not going to be gray or black. It's going to be some warm yellow ochre mixture. And if you have access to software like Blender, they have some really nice lighting simulations on there that can help you to kind of experiment with that. It's not that I'm not computer savvy, it's just I don't have the patience for that kind of thing. So like I prefer to go paint outdoors, and you kind of get the same experience from either, and either one is as absurd as the other, I think. So it's just sort of like, yeah, pick your absurdity. But see, I'm just continuing to add lights, and here again, that's a cool highlight with the warmer gray forming the shadow of that part of the kimono. And I actually had prints made of this painting. I liked the painting a lot. It did sell, and I don't really think that it has broad appeal, just because it's kind of an odd subject. It's not a conventional painting that you would see in everyone's home, and Asian decor is not really common, I don't think. But I had a few giclée prints made, 2 remain. If anyone wants one, you can contact me on my website about them, and I can get you one framed and all of that. And I think I may have some available directly on my website, and if I don't, I probably should do that, but it's been low on my list of priorities. I plan to try to have more print-on-demand things available on my website soon. Right now I have my Sigmund Freud t-shirts, which I'm very proud of. And so far, I've offered my newsletter subscribers have had the opportunity to get a free Freud t-shirt if they pay for the shipping, and no one has claimed it. So that is on them, but I have 2 Sigmund Freud t-shirts that I wear proudly and often. But there's no accounting for good taste. But if you would like to be eligible to win a free Sigmund Freud t-shirt, or find out more about my studio practice and my musings on all things art and art criticism and a bit of politics thrown in occasionally, you can sign up for my free monthly newsletter. I don't spam anyone. It comes out once a month, and it's very easy to sign up through the obnoxious pop-up ads that I've added to my website in following suit, having seen many gallerists and professionals who have done the same. And if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to like it and share it with your kinfolk. And I appreciate you watching, and I hope I will not be as long in producing the next video.